Hello, thank you for coming to watch this video, continuing our lessons on the Ojibwe. When it comes to the textbook, anytime you see something that says watch video, you click on that and a video will open up. So make sure you're doing that for any time you see watch a video in the ebook. When we talked about fishing with the Dakota, we talked the men handled fishing year round. That is different with the Ojibwe. In the warmer months when there was not ice on the water, the women took care of the fishing during that time. They typically, before nightfall, they would go put weighted nets. So they put weights in the bottom of the nets to keep them down, have them stretch out a little bit so they don't float to the top. Then in the morning, they would go check their nets for any fish they might have. Sometimes they'd also use spears, traps, and hooks, things like that. When they would get ice on the water, the men would then do the fishing. The first thing they would do is they'd cut a hole in the ice. They'd put some sort of shelter over themselves to make it a little easier to see through that hole. Then they'd use a wooden decoy or lure to try to attract the fish. And then when the fish would come, they would spear the fish. So if you watch this video, it shows you a little bit about how they speared the fish during winter fishing and also how they smoked the fish to make it last longer. This chapter on the Ojibwe, the textbook breaks it down by season. So the first season we have is spring or Ziguan. Another difference between the Ojibwe and the Dakota is the Ojibwe are moving different places each season. And sometimes they'll live in large villages, large groups, or other times they'll live more independent on their own, just in their families. So in the spring or Ziguan, just like the Dakota, the Ojibwe, those that were close to maple trees, would move to the sugar camp. And they would harvest maple sugar, just like the Dakota did. So you collect the maple sap, you boil it down, you get a syrup, you boil it down even more, you boil it to a sugar. And children helped with that process. And as you read here, boys and girls ran back and forth delivering the sap to the sugar house. And the sugar house is where the sap was boiled down. So it was a family project. And you can see maple sugar is
maple sugar, a sweet substance made by boiling sap from a maple tree. In Ojibwe, zinzibakwat.
So zinzibakwat is maple sugar. So that's once the sap gets boiled down to a syrup and then gets boiled down even more to a sugar. And they use birch bark containers like this because that's one nice thing about birch bark, waterproof, and it works perfect for containers. And speaking of birch bark, another thing that Ojibwe would do during the spring is make birch bark canoes. And you can see basically they just create the frame of the canoe with the birch bark, giving it that canoe shape. And then they would help sealing it with spruce gum, with spruce gum, which is kind of a gluey type substance that seals up anytime the birch bark comes together to make sure that it's waterproof. You don't want a canoe that's going to sink. So this page was just showing that they played lacrosse. Lacrosse is a sport popular amongst many Native American groups. And then here are some different Ojibwe names. So you have
Gichizibi, Great River, Mississippi River.
So the Ojibwe name is Gichizibi. In English, that translates to Great River, and we're talking about the Mississippi River. Then you have
Bemidjigamog, lake where current flows directly across the water. Bemidji.
Or then you also have
Winnipegoshish, dirty water. Lake Winnipegoshish.
And then you have
Gachigami, Great Lake. Lake Superior.
And some pronounce that Gitchigumi, so either pronunciation is correct. And then you have
Monoman, wild rice. Monoman.
So some of these terms I expect you to know when we come time for our test. And then in the summer, or as the Ojibwe language, Nibin, they pack up their belongings, they into their birch bark canoes, they leave the maple sugaring grounds, and they head to their summer village. And again, they usually want to try to be by a source of water if they can, whether it's a lake or river, just makes life easier. And that's when they're starting to live in their wigwams. And wigwams, you learn, were their structures. During the summer, they are living in large communities, so large villages this time. The reason they're living in large groups now, in the summer, it's easier to provide food for that many people. We'll learn come winter that they separate to be more independent because it's harder to provide food in winter. So if you have smaller groups, a little easier to provide food for that. So in the summer, they'd have dances, celebrations. They'd help with harvesting crops like this one up here.
Corn, the most important crop grown by the Ojibwe in the summer. In Ojibwe, Mandamin.
So summer was a time for planting crops, harvesting crops, things like that. And one thing I'd like to point out down here is the men did not do a lot of hunting in the summer. They wanted the animals to reproduce, so they wanted larger populations of animals, and that way they would stay strong. They didn't want to wipe out the entire animal population. So in the summer, that was a time for the men to travel, to trade with other groups, or maybe fight their neighbors if they need to. So a lot of activity going on in the summer. And then just this part up here about human capital. We talked in the Dakota chapter about human capital being the skills and knowledge you need to earn an income. And there's 4 ways to improve that. Get educated, take care of your body, talk to somebody that can help you with that type of stuff, and just learn more and practice your skills. So practicing. So here this talked about how the Ojibwe boys and girls helped improve their human capital. And in the fall, or Dugwagan, just like the Dakota, those that were able to in the Ojibwe culture, they would harvest wild rice. So you can see there's another video here about harvesting wild rice. So make sure you make it to watch that. And and make sure there was one about maple sugaring I forgot to point out. Make sure you watch that video too. So now in the fall, they harvest their crops, they leave their summer villages, and they go to wild rice. And they're going to spend time harvesting wild rice. And again, using canoes, as you can see in this picture here. That's just they're working together to harvest wild rice, just like the Dakota did. And this was a family affair. So just like the Dakota, the Ojibwe families did it. And then this just talks about the process of how they harvested the wild rice, how they separated. Very similar to what the Dakota did, but I don't want to go over that step by step. That's something you can read. And then here you can read in this blue part, read about how today wild rice is a big business for a lot of Native American groups. The next couple days, you're going to finish reading about winter or baboon, and then you'll get to the end of the chapter. So I'll have another video that summarizes these last few pictures. Just make sure, as I said, you're taking time to watch anytime there's a video, read things carefully, and make sure you are filling in your packets as you go. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about anything. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.